I still remember that morning as if it were etched into my memory, a quiet prelude to the chaos that would soon follow. I had always prided myself on leading a peaceful, unassuming life in our upscale neighborhood, a community where every house was immaculate, every garden perfectly tended. I was John, a simple homeowner who believed in the sanctity of personal space and mutual respect among neighbors. That morning, as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, I awoke with a sense of calm anticipation. I brewed my morning coffee and sat by the window, enjoying the gentle hum of suburban life. It was one of those rare mornings when everything felt just right. But as I glanced out the window, I noticed something that instantly set my heart pounding with a mix of irritation and disbelief. There, in the space that had always belonged solely to me, the garage, sat a car that was unmistakably not mine. I had seen that car before, albeit from a distance on the street. It was a sleek, modern vehicle that exuded an air of entitlement and flashiness, much like its owner. I knew the type, Karen. Karen was notorious in our community, a woman who carried herself with a sense of superiority and entitlement that bordered on arrogance. She had earned quite the reputation online as well, thanks to her knack for stirring up trouble and broadcasting her antics for all to see. In our little world of pristine lawns and quiet evenings, Karen was an anomaly, her presence disruptive, her behavior challenging the unspoken rules we all lived by. As I stood there, a feeling of violation settled over me. The garage wasn't just a building. It was my sanctuary, a space that symbolized the personal boundaries I had worked so hard to maintain. And there it was, invaded by Karen's car, parked with a casual disregard that screamed, "This is my right now." It wasn't simply about an illegal parking spot. It was a blatant dismissal of the norms that ensured our community functioned smoothly. I remember walking outside to inspect the situation. The morning air was cool, a stark contrast to the warmth of my frustration. There it was, the car, gleaming under the morning light, as if it were mocking me with its audacity. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I knew that any confrontation with Karen would only escalate things, but I also couldn't allow such a blatant infringement on my property to go unchallenged. My mind raced with thoughts of all the other times Karen had flaunted her special status around the neighborhood. I recalled stories of her dismissing parking rules, her entitlement in insisting that every rule was merely a suggestion for those beneath her. It wasn't the first time she had stirred trouble, but this was different. It wasn't a social media stunt or an online rant. It was a direct violation of my personal space, and that was something I simply couldn't let slide. With each step towards the garage, the quiet of the morning was gradually replaced by the pounding of my heartbeat. I couldn't help but wonder what had possessed her to park in my garage. Was it a simple act of carelessness, or did it carry a message? A deliberate challenge to everything I held dear? The thought unsettled me, hinting at deeper undercurrents of disrespect that might be brewing beneath the surface of our seemingly tranquil neighborhood. As I reached the garage door, I hesitated for just a moment. There was something almost surreal about the situation. I placed my hand on the cold metal of the door and pushed it open slowly, half expecting Karen to be there, grinning in her usual smug fashion. Instead, I found only the empty space where my car normally resided. And there it was, in the middle of the room, parked with an air of absolute disregard, as if it were an invitation to defy the rules that governed our little community. I stood there, torn between anger and a peculiar sense of resignation. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about a parking spot. It was about a larger battle of values. I had always believed in fairness, in the unspoken agreement that every neighbor would respect one another's space and privacy. Karen's intrusion was more than a physical encroachment. It was a challenge to the very principles that upheld the integrity of our neighborhood. The more I pondered the situation, the more I saw it as a defining moment. This was the spark that would ignite a conflict between two very different worldviews. On one side was my quiet, respectful existence, and on the other Karen's unabashed assertion of her perceived rights. It was as though she believed that the rules were made to accommodate her whims, that her online persona and the attention it garnered granted her the power to override common decency. I couldn't shake the thought that perhaps this act was more calculated than a mere oversight. Was it possible that Karen parked her car in my garage intentionally, as a provocation? The notion made my blood boil, yet I knew that reacting impulsively would only feed into her desire for attention. Instead, I resolved to approach the matter with the measured calm of someone who believed in justice over spectacle. That day, as I closed the garage door behind me, I was filled with a mix of determination and trepidation. I knew that addressing this incident would set off a chain reaction, a confrontation that could expose the raw edges of a community trying to hold onto its values amid the disruptive forces of modern entitlement. I also felt an unexpected surge of responsibility. Here was an opportunity to stand up not just for myself, but for every person in our neighborhood who had ever felt marginalized by the arrogant disregard of someone who thought the world should bend to her will. In the following hours, I mulled over how best to handle the situation. I debated calling Karen to ask her to move the car, but the thought of engaging with her directly filled me with a quiet dread. I had heard the stories, seen the posts online, and knew that any interaction with her could quickly spiral into a public spectacle. Yet, there was also a part of me that was tired of the constant need to police boundaries, of having to choose between maintaining peace and asserting my rights. As the day wore on, the neighborhood buzzed with its usual gentle activity. Neighbors exchanged greetings, children played in the park, and life continued in its familiar rhythm. But beneath that surface of tranquility, I felt the stirrings of a conflict that would soon capture the attention of not just our little community, but the wider world, thanks to the ever-watchful eye of social media. Karen's actions, seemingly minor in isolation, had set in motion a chain of events that would soon force us all to confront uncomfortable truths about entitlement, respect, and the erosion of community values. That morning marked a turning point, a fateful encounter that challenged my deeply held beliefs about the sanctity of personal space and the unwritten rules of neighborly conduct. I realized that sometimes, even in the most peaceful environments, a single act of defiance could ripple out and disturb the delicate balance of everyday life. And in that disturbance, there lay the potential for change, a reckoning that would force each of us to reconsider what it truly means to live in a community. So, as I reflected on that morning, I couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. Karen's car in my garage was more than an act of territorial incursion. It was a symbol of a larger, more insidious challenge. A challenge to the values we held dear and a test of our resolve in standing up for what was right. And though I didn't know it then, this confrontation would soon pave the way for a series of events that would forever alter the fabric of our community. By mid-morning, after the shock had worn off and my mind had churned with thoughts of all the times Karen had flaunted her entitlement, I reached a decision. It was time to put an end to this blatant disregard for my space and for the unwritten rules of respect that we all silently upheld in our neighborhood. I stood in my living room, staring at the garage door with a mixture of determination and apprehension. The idea came to me in a sudden flash. I would lock the garage door, not merely as a symbolic gesture but as a concrete action, a way of saying that her intrusion would no longer be tolerated. In that moment, the garage transformed from a mere structure into a fortress, a bastion of my personal sanctuary and the boundaries I was determined to protect. Without wasting another minute, I fetched the heavy padlock that had long been relegated to a forgotten drawer. My hands trembled slightly as I worked the lock into place, a physical manifestation of my inner resolve. With each click of the lock engaging, I felt a growing sense of empowerment. This wasn't just about a parking space. It was about reasserting my rights and taking a stand against the unyielding tide of entitlement that Karen embodied. Once the lock was secured, I stepped back and took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. I knew that by taking this action, I was setting off a chain of events that could very well spiral out of control. But the thought of Karen continuing to violate my personal space was unbearable. I needed to make her understand that such actions had consequences. And so, I made another bold decision. I decided to leave my house for a week. I'd step away from the immediate pressure, forcing both of us to confront the situation from a distance. And perhaps, in that forced absence, the gravity of her actions would sink in. Packing a small bag, I left behind my familiar surroundings, my heart pounding with the anticipation of what was to come. As I drove away, a part of me felt relief, as if the act of leaving was a way to momentarily escape the tension and chaos that had been building inside me. Yet, deep down, I also sensed that I was stepping into uncharted territory, where the lines between right and wrong, justice and revenge, would blur in ways I couldn't yet foresee. It wasn't long before I started hearing murmurs on social media. Karen's reaction had been swift and explosive. Within hours of my departure, my phone began buzzing incessantly with notifications. Comments, shares, and messages flooding in from neighbors and online acquaintances. Karen had taken to every platform at her disposal, broadcasting her outrage far and wide. In her posts, she claimed that I had crossed a line, that my actions were not only overbearing but also an assault on her personal rights. The narrative was painted in broad strokes of victimhood, and she called on our community to rally behind her, to stand with someone who was being unjustly treated. I sat in a small cafe in a neighboring town, the soft murmur of conversations around me barely penetrating the bubble of my thoughts. I couldn't help but replay the events over and over in my head. Had I really done the right thing? Was locking the garage door and leaving for a week a reasonable response? Or had I let my anger dictate my actions? Every time I scrolled through my phone, I saw Karen's face, smug and defiant, accompanying every post. Her followers, many of whom had never even met her, seemed to echo her sentiments without a second thought. I started receiving messages from neighbors, some expressing support for my decision, while others cautioned that my actions might escalate into something uncontrollable. One neighbor, Mark, even stopped by my temporary lodging to offer a few words of advice. "John," he said with a concerned tone, "I get where you're coming from, but sometimes these things have a way of spiraling. Are you sure this is what you want?" His words, though well-meaning, only fueled the inner debate that had been raging since that morning. I knew I had to stand my ground, but I couldn't help but wonder if I was setting a dangerous precedent. After all, taking a stand against entitlement is one thing, but provoking it can sometimes lead to unintended consequences. Despite the turmoil, I remained resolute. I recalled the countless instances when Karen had acted as if the rules were mere suggestions, instances that, until now, I had brushed off as trivial annoyances. But this time, the violation was too personal to ignore. Every locked door and every abandoned moment in my garage was a testament to the fact that boundaries exist for a reason. As I watched the digital battle unfold from afar, I felt a strange sense of detachment. I was no longer just a passive observer of my own life. I had become a central figure in a narrative that was rapidly spiraling into a public spectacle. The digital outrage reached fever pitch. Karen's posts were laced with accusations of authoritarian behavior, portraying my actions as an overreaction driven by stubborn pride. I noticed that the comment sections were polarized, with some defending her right to express her discontent while others applauded my decisive stand. The once quiet neighborhood was now abuzz with debates on entitlement, privacy, and the limits of acceptable behavior. It felt as if our community had been thrust into the limelight, with every member forced to take a side. I spent many evenings grappling with the moral implications of my choices. I questioned whether a single act of defiance could really spark such widespread controversy. In the solitude of my rented room, I scribbled in a journal, notes filled with raw emotions and existential queries. Was I, by locking the door and absconding, abandoning a part of my responsibility to maintain peace? Or was I, in fact, doing the only thing I could to assert the value of personal space in a world that increasingly celebrated individual entitlement over collective harmony? Days passed slowly. I traveled through small towns and rural landscapes, all the while keeping an eye on social media and the unfolding drama back home. I found solace in nature and in the anonymity of being away from the site of the conflict. Yet, every time I saw a news update or a heated post online, I was reminded that the battle was far from over. Karen's followers were relentless, and her narrative had evolved into something far larger than just a parking dispute. It had become a symbol of resistance against what she claimed was an unjust overreach, a narrative that resonated with many who felt marginalized in their own ways. In moments of quiet reflection, I couldn't shake off the underlying sadness. This was not the life I had envisioned. A life defined by endless conflicts and social media wars over trivial matters. I had always believed that respect and understanding could bridge any divide, but the situation was proving otherwise. Instead of a civilized debate, we were witnessing a war of words, where every comment was a shot fired and every like a vote of approval for defiance. One evening, as I sat by the window of my temporary refuge, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I began to understand the true gravity of what I had set in motion. My act of locking the garage door, a decision born out of frustration and a desire for justice, had become a catalyst for a much larger conversation. It was a reminder that even the smallest actions can ripple through the fabric of society, challenging deeply held beliefs and forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths. I realized that this wasn't just about me versus Karen. It was about the values we hold dear, about community, respect, and the boundaries that define our lives. While I had hoped that my absence would serve as a wake-up call, forcing Karen to reckon with the consequences of her actions, I now understood that the repercussions were far more profound than I had anticipated. As the week drew to a close, I braced myself for the inevitable confrontation. I knew that when I returned, I would have to face Karen head-on, and the showdown was bound to be more than just a clash of personalities. It would be a collision of ideologies, a test of whether true accountability could be achieved in a world where social media often distorts reality. In those long, reflective days away from home, I began to see that conflict, painful as it might be, was sometimes necessary to spark change. The struggle was not about personal vendetta, but about reclaiming the dignity of our shared space. By the time I returned home, the digital battleground had already transformed into a full-blown war zone. Karen's live streams had become the talk of the town. Her every angry gesture, every impassioned rant was being broadcast live, capturing the attention of our entire community and even drawing in local journalists. I watched from a distance, my heart heavy with the knowledge that this confrontation was spiraling into something far beyond a mere parking dispute. The online world and the reality of our once peaceful neighborhood had collided, and I was caught in the middle. In the early hours of my return, I decided to take a quiet stroll around the block, trying to gather my thoughts. Every step I took was accompanied by the distant hum of conversations, neighbors discussing the saga, some in support of Karen's claims, others echoing my own sense of indignation. I couldn't help but notice that the air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for the next explosive development. That evening, as Karen's latest live stream blared from every device in our community, I took refuge in my study, poring over the footage I had secretly recorded during the week. I had set up discreet cameras around the garage before locking the door, a decision that had weighed on me heavily. The recordings not only captured Karen's furious outbursts but also revealed moments that I hadn't expected. Amid the chaos, there were glimpses of her methodically manipulating the situation, carefully choosing her words to portray herself as the victim. It was a masterclass in deflection and public relations, and I knew that once the truth came out, the balance of power would shift dramatically. I spent hours rewatching every clip, taking careful notes of every detail that might expose the darker side of Karen's actions. And then, as I rewound a particular segment, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a detail that I had overlooked before. In one of the recordings, while Karen was venting her frustration on camera, I noticed a small, almost imperceptible glimmer in the background of my garage. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I decided to examine the footage more closely. As the camera panned across the cluttered space, the lens briefly captured a stack of old, dusty boxes tucked away in a dark corner of the garage. At first, I dismissed it as just another bit of forgotten clutter. But then, I noticed something odd about one of the boxes. It had a strange emblem on it, something that didn't belong among the usual remnants of a family's past. My pulse quickened as I recalled faint whispers I had heard about Karen's past. A scandal, murky and unspoken, that she had desperately tried to bury under layers of charm and defiant audacity. I replayed the footage again and again, each time noticing the same unsettling detail. This wasn't just a random pile of old belongings. It was something far more sinister. The emblem on the box bore a resemblance to a crest I had seen in an old news article, one that was linked to a scandal involving financial fraud and personal betrayal. The revelation was like a jolt of electricity. I realized that Karen had been hiding a secret, one that, if exposed, could completely upend her carefully crafted public persona. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of the discovery pressed upon me, and I felt an overwhelming need to uncover the truth behind the mysterious emblem. I began to dig into old records and local archives, piecing together fragments of information that had long been shrouded in mystery. Slowly, a disturbing picture began to form. A picture of a woman who had not only defied the norms of our community, but had also engaged in deceit that stretched far beyond the bounds of a simple parking dispute. As I delved deeper, I found references to a scandal that had rocked a similar neighborhood years ago. The details were murky, but one thing was clear. Someone with Karen's profile had been involved in a high-stakes scheme that ruined lives and tarnished reputations. It seemed that the box in my garage wasn't just a forgotten relic. It was a hidden repository of evidence, a remnant of a past that Karen had fought tooth and nail to keep buried. The implications were staggering. The public outcry that had already begun to swell against her would soon become an avalanche if this secret were to be fully exposed. In the days that followed, the digital and physical worlds continued to clash in unpredictable ways. Karen's live broadcasts grew more frantic and erratic as she sensed the noose tightening around her. Her supporters, once loyal and unwavering, began to murmur about inconsistencies in her story. I noticed a shift in the tone of online discussions. What had started as a simple debate over parking etiquette was morphing into an intense scrutiny of her entire character. I decided that it was time to confront this reality head-on. With the evidence I had gathered and the recordings in hand, I arranged a meeting with a trusted local journalist, Sarah, who had been covering the escalating drama from the beginning. Sarah was known for her commitment to uncovering the truth, and I felt that her involvement could ensure that the story reached a wider audience with the necessary gravity. Over coffee in a small, discreet diner, I explained everything to her: Karen's blatant disregard for community norms, her manipulative online persona, and the startling discovery from the garage footage. Sarah listened intently, her eyes narrowing as she took in each detail. "John," she said softly, "this isn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. This could be something much bigger, an expose on the dark underbelly of entitlement and deceit." Her words echoed in my mind as we left the diner, a sense of urgency propelling us both forward. We agreed to collaborate in unraveling the full extent of Karen's hidden past, ensuring that the story was told accurately and responsibly. Meanwhile, the digital storm raged on. Karen, realizing that the tide was turning against her, resorted to increasingly desperate measures. In a particularly heated livestream, she hurled accusations at anyone who dared question her integrity. Her face, once so composed, was now a mask of barely contained fury. Yet, even as she ranted, I could see the flicker of anxiety in her eyes, a silent admission that she was losing control of the narrative. The recording of that moment became a turning point, a powerful piece of evidence that Sarah later used in her investigative report. The turning point in this tumultuous chapter came unexpectedly one evening. While reviewing more of the footage, I discovered that the mysterious box had been moved. It wasn't in the same position as before, and its contents were partially exposed. A tangle of documents and photographs that hinted at the scandal I had pieced together. I couldn't help but feel a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the incontrovertible proof that could unmask the full extent of Karen's misdeeds. With trembling hands, I began to sort through the evidence, carefully documenting each item, every scrap of paper that painted a picture of a meticulously concealed past. The documents revealed details that were hard to believe. A series of financial transactions, coded communications, and even photographs that hinted at personal relationships that had been violently severed by scandal. The more I uncovered, the more I understood that Karen's public defiance was not born solely of arrogance, but of a desperate need to shield herself from a history that could destroy her reputation entirely. It was a past riddled with betrayal, manipulation, and a calculated effort to rebuild her life from the ashes of a once devastating downfall. Armed with this explosive information, I knew that the final act of this confrontation was imminent. The digital realm, once a tool for Karen to amplify her voice, was now a weapon against her. Her live streams, once platforms for her unfiltered anger, had transformed into broadcasts of her unraveling facade. Neighbors, once divided in their loyalties, began to rally behind the truth, calling for accountability and transparency. I remember the day when everything came to a head. The local news station, having caught wind of the scandal, set up an impromptu press conference in our neighborhood. Cameras, microphones, and reporters converged on the site of what had once been a simple residential street. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of anticipation and tension, every onlooker aware that history was being written before their eyes. Karen, cornered by mounting evidence and public scrutiny, appeared on the local news in a last-ditch effort to salvage her reputation. But as she spoke, her words came out as disjointed and frantic, the veneer of control cracking with each passing moment. The hidden evidence I had gathered was referenced indirectly by several witnesses, and it wasn't long before Sarah's detailed exposé hit every major news outlet. The scandal that had been so carefully locked away in a dusty corner of my garage was now splashed across headlines, a testament to the power of truth over deceit. That day, as I watched the live coverage from a distance, I felt a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction, a sense of justice finally being served, but also a profound sadness that it had come to this. The once small, personal battle over a parking spot had escalated into a public reckoning that exposed not only Karen's hidden past, but also the vulnerabilities of our community in the digital age. In the aftermath, the community was forced to confront the realities of entitlement, deception, and the ways in which our private lives could be manipulated for public spectacle. The lines between the online persona and the real person had been irrevocably blurred, leaving behind scars that would take time to heal. And as I stood amidst the fallout, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of it all. How a single act of defiance had opened a Pandora's box of secrets, forever changing the fabric of our once idyllic neighborhood. I knew the tension was reaching its breaking point. After an agonizing week of isolation, self-reflection, and mounting evidence that had slowly unraveled Karen's carefully constructed facade, the final confrontation was inevitable. I remember the air on that fateful day as thick with anticipation and the quiet hum of a community bracing for impact. The sun had barely risen when I found myself standing on the front steps of my house. My hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a mix of determination and solemn responsibility. The neighborhood had gathered, drawn by the magnetism of a story that had shifted from a mere parking dispute to a full-blown exposé of deceit and entitlement. The faces around me reflected a spectrum of emotions, anger, disbelief, and an eager curiosity that spoke of a community ready for accountability. Karen arrived amidst a cacophony of whispers and stares, her posture rigid and her expression a blend of defiance and dread. It was as if she sensed that the carefully shielded walls of her secrets were finally crumbling. I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside. This wasn't just about reclaiming my space, it was about setting things right, about ensuring that truth and respect prevailed over the manipulations of arrogance. Karen, I began, my voice echoing across the silent, expectant crowd, this isn't just about a car in a garage. This is about accountability and the respect we owe one another in our community. Every word I uttered was weighed down by months of frustration and the painstaking process of gathering evidence that now lay indisputable before us. Karen's eyes darted around as if seeking an escape in the sea of faces that now bore witness to her fall. For a brief moment, I saw the glimmer of vulnerability beneath her defiant exterior, a vulnerability that had been hidden so meticulously until now. The turning point came when I presented the evidence, the recordings, the mysterious documents from the old box, the undeniable connection to a past scandal that she had fought so desperately to bury. With every piece laid out, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, transforming into a collective cry for justice. A local reporter, whose presence had become synonymous with uncovering the truth in our neighborhood, stepped forward and began asking pointed questions. "Karen, can you explain this?" The reporter held up a document that linked her to financial transactions and personal betrayals that shook the foundation of the public persona she had built. Karen's face drained of color, and for a moment, the bravado that had once defined her seemed to evaporate in the morning light. In that charged moment, Karen's attempts to deflect the mounting evidence became increasingly desperate. She stammered, her voice quivering as she tried to spin tales of misunderstanding and misinterpretation. But the more she spoke, the more her words unraveled, revealing a tapestry of deceit and manipulation that was impossible to ignore. The crowd's reaction was swift and unyielding, a mixture of disappointment and righteous indignation that underscored how deeply her actions had betrayed not only her own integrity but the trust of the entire community. It was then that I took a deep breath and addressed the crowd directly. We all have our battles and our hidden pasts, but when those secrets come at the expense of the community's trust and respect, we must face the consequences. Today, we stand together not just for me or for Karen, but for every single person who believes in fairness and accountability. My voice was calm yet resolute, each word carrying the weight of the moral imperative that had driven me to this moment. I could sense a shift in the atmosphere as neighbors who had been silently watching and waiting for this moment began to murmur in agreement. Their support was palpable, a testament to the idea that sometimes the most significant battles are fought not with fists or fury but with the unwavering commitment to truth and justice. And as the pressure mounted, Karen's resolve seemed to waver further. It was as though the community's collective voice had grown too loud to be silenced by lies and manipulation. As the confrontation reached its zenith, legal authorities were gently ushered into the unfolding drama, a necessary step given the gravity of the hidden scandals and the potential legal ramifications of Karen's past actions. It was not a victory of one person over another, but a moment where the rule of law reasserted itself, ensuring that accountability was not a privilege for the powerful but a right for everyone. Karen's reaction to the presence of law enforcement was one of resigned acceptance. There was no dramatic outburst, no further attempts at persuasion, only a silent acknowledgement that the era of unchecked entitlement had come to an end. The local news, which had followed every twist and turn of the saga, broadcast the entire confrontation live. In every household, the community was forced to witness the stark reality of what happens when entitlement is left unchecked. The headlines that followed were not merely about a parking dispute or a neighborhood feud. They were about the transformative power of standing up against injustice, about the strength of a community united in its demand for truth. In the days that followed, Karen faced a cascade of consequences. Legally, the evidence against her led to charges related to fraud and concealment, a stark reminder that actions have repercussions even when cloaked in the guise of charm and defiance. The community, meanwhile, began a slow process of healing. I found myself reflecting on the bittersweet nature of the victory. It was not a triumph over a single adversary, but a reckoning with the pervasive culture of entitlement that had threatened to erode the values we held dear. I, too, was forced to reckon with the extremes of my actions. There was a lingering sense of regret, not for taking a stand, but for the painful realization that sometimes achieving justice requires venturing into moral gray areas. I had crossed lines that I never thought I would, and yet, in that crossing, I had illuminated a path toward a more honest, accountable community. It was a difficult lesson, one that underscored the complexity of human relationships and the sometimes harsh demands of moral responsibility. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, as I sat alone in my now unguarded garage, a space that had been both a sanctuary and a battleground, I began to piece together the larger implications of what had transpired. The incident was a microcosm of a larger societal struggle, the fight between individual entitlement and collective responsibility, between personal freedom and the shared norms that bind us together. It was a stark reminder that every action, no matter how personal it may seem, has the potential to ripple outwards and impact the lives of many. Standing on that threshold, I realized that the true victory was not in the downfall of one person, but in the reaffirmation of a community's right to live without the constant fear of exploitation. It was a call to every individual to recognize their power, not just to confront wrongdoing, but to foster an environment where respect and accountability were the norm. My journey had been fraught with conflict and controversy, but in its wake, it left a legacy of vigilance and a renewed commitment to the values that truly matter. As I closed the door on that turbulent chapter, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held. The scars of the confrontation would take time to heal, but they also served as a reminder that the pursuit of justice is never a simple, clean endeavor. It is messy and complicated, fraught with moral dilemmas and unforeseen consequences. Yet, in that messiness lies the possibility for real, meaningful change, a change that starts with the courage to stand up for what is right, even when the stakes are immeasurably high. In the end, the saga of the locked garage and the unmasking of Karen was more than just a personal battle. It was a clarion call for accountability, a testament to the resilience of community values in the face of modern entitlement. And though the wounds it left behind might never fully disappear, they would forever serve as a reminder that true justice, though hard won, is worth every sacrifice.